Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our friends and colleagues around the world. I'm delighted to welcome you to the final session of day 2 of the Sporting Chance Forum 2021, brought to you by the Centre for Sport and Human Rights. My name's Kat Craig. I'm a senior advisor here at the Centre, and it is my privilege to be your moderator today. I am really excited about this session, tackling some important topics that I hope you will all be able to share and contribute to, and some brilliant speakers. But before I introduce you to them, I would just like to tackle a couple of housekeeping matters. The first, I want to share with you, importantly, a trigger warning about some of the content of this session. The topic today is safeguarding the well-being of affected persons throughout the remedy process. And we'll be framing some of the challenges and learnings around the remedy process through the lens of abuse in sport, meaning non-accidental violence, particularly the experience of athletes. Now, we won't be discussing in any detail that content, but I still think it has the potential to be distressing, especially for those who have experienced abuse or trauma. So here's a heads up on a couple of the things that we may tackle. I will make some passing references of examples or types of abuse. We may be discussing some of the impacts of abuse, including the manifestation of trauma, and at times we'll be referencing victims and survivors' experience, often when they've been let down by institutions that they've asked for help. So I'll give you a minute to make a decision about whether that is triggering and encourage you to prioritise your well-being. Lucy will pop in the chat some materials from Safe Sport International, resources where you can get help around the world. And for others who are engaging in the conversation, of course, we want people to be open and honest, but I also ask you to be mindful that this is a sensitive topic. So please reflect a little bit about your phrasing and questions. If in doubt and you don't want to be insensitive, feel free to connect with me bilaterally and we can discuss. And speaking about connecting, hopefully you've already explored the platform. There are lots of ways to connect with other attendees. If, like me, you're desperately sad that we still can't meet in person, there are opportunities to network, so hit me up there, make sure that you chat and meet other people. I also would love to refer you to the Centre's website, sporthumanrights.org. Follow us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, @sportandrights. And please do use the social wall in this platform and also your usual social media, #SDF21. And there will also be replays through this platform. Finally, the last piece of housekeeping before I move on to the introduction of the topic, use the chat function for any questions and comments. Time is not our friend. We have an hour tonight, but we will try and tackle as many of your questions as possible. And if we don't get round to them now, we'll do so later in the forum or we'll circle back to you. So just a little bit of an introduction in terms of why we chose this topic as one of the topics at the Sporting Chance Forum. The title is Safeguarding the Wellbeing of Affected Persons Throughout the Remedy Process. Or I think perhaps a little bit more snappy could be how to get it right when things have gone wrong. And the premise of the session is that, of course, prevention is better than cure. And great progress has been made in safeguarding when it comes to education, training, policies, practical things like criminal record checks. But the reality remains that despite all of this, we are seeing case after case of abuse in sport. And that is across sports, across continents, where really courageous athletes have called out poor practice and abusive conduct. And just last week, you will all have followed, there are no sports or countries immune from this. The NWSL in the US has almost been brought to its knees by deeply worrying and concerning allegations. So we have to face the facts that sport, with all of the power dynamics that it involves, and sometimes, unfortunately, a win-at-all-costs attitude, is vulnerable to abuse. And the protections currently in place don't close all of the holes in the safeguarding nets. So that means that we also have to create systems that allow people to flag when those protections are failing. And then we need to really diligently investigate and respond appropriate. And the evidence is overwhelming that all of us need to learn and get better at this, because a central theme of many of the conversations that we're hearing from athletes is that they either felt unable to report, or when they reported, that people didn't listen. Even when investigations happened, they have at times been inadequate. Let's again look at the NWSL case, where the coach in question was supposedly investigated by Portland in 2015. There was a conclusion drawn that he'd violated policies, and yet he was rehired within the NWSL. And as the NWSL Players Association said, these are systemic failures. So let's look at those systems and let's try and find constructive, pragmatic solutions where we all work together to improve them. And we're doing that today from the perspective of those most affected, the victims and survivors. Now, that's in part because as a person who's been the victim of a human rights violation, of course, their experience and their needs should be central. They have a right to remedy in domestic law and international law, and also a right for the process when they engage in investigations by sports bodies or others to make sure that that is safe and constructive rather than re-traumatizing. But there's another reason that the perspective of affected persons is so important. We need those people to engage. When governing bodies responsible for keeping sports safe cannot do their job because they're not getting reports, and affected persons don't feel able to engage or tell people what went wrong, then the process fails. Without affected persons' input, we can't understand what went wrong. We can't prevent it from happening in the future. So, in short, when we look at remedy, it really is closely linked to prevention. And that's what we're going to be discussing with the help of three wonderful speakers who I've had the pleasure and privilege of working with in recent years, all who have been innovative in trying to tackle some of these difficult and important questions. So I'll introduce you to them now before I hand over in my first question. First off, Dr. Georgia Sullivan, who competed internationally in both aerobic and artistic gymnastics, represented New Zealand in women's artistic gymnastics, including in the 2006 Commonwealth Games, is also an author of the book Degrees of Difficulty. Based on her PhD and extensive publications, she's an expert on gender, abuse, coaching, governance, and athletes' rights in gymnastics. And I've had the privilege of learning from Georgia in New Zealand. She's been a very vocal advocate for the survivors of abuse in New Zealand gymnastics. And I've learned so much from her and colleagues when it comes to the challenges that survivors face in engaging in the remedy process. So thank you, Georgia, for joining. And next up, Joyce Cook, Chief Social Responsibility and Education Officer at FIFA, responsible for the organization's human rights and anti-discrimination program, child protection and safeguarding, and sustainability and the environment. She is a busy woman, as you can imagine, and has, unsurprisingly for those who know her, won various awards for her services, including to disability and sport at national and international levels. And on a personal note, I've had the pleasure of working with Joyce and seeing how tirelessly she has tried to introduce survivor-centered practices when FIFA has been asked to intervene in some really difficult cases around the world. So I'm really happy that you could join us today. Thank you, Joyce. And finally, last but very much not least, Dr. Yetsa Tuakli, who among her many credentials is assistant professor at Yale School of Public Health. She runs Sports Equity Lab and Interdisciplinary Research Group. She was a long jumper on Ghana's national team until 2016. She was the International Paralympic Committee's inaugural welfare officer and is a member of the IOC's working group to prevent harassment and abuse in sport. And again, I've learned so much from you, Yetsa, already. We sit together on the academic advisory board for the IOC Safeguarding Officer in Sport certificates. So all of these women, I'm sure, will share really valuable expertise and knowledge. Let's get straight into it. And I'd like to put my first question perhaps to you, Georgia, if that's okay. Help us frame this session. It's a session focusing on the remedy process. It's about righting the wrongs that have occurred. As an expert, as an athlete, can you kick off the conversation by explaining a little bit about what remedy means to you, what it's meant to some of the survivors that you've worked with, and what are we aiming for when it comes to their expectation and experience?
Great question. Thanks, Kat. So I think the key thing is about establishing what went wrong and a willingness to learn from mistakes of the past. So if we think about framing this in terms of, an investigation that sets out a narrative in which institutions or the people in question are actors in that narrative, what did they do or not do to cause where we are now? Because building on that, we can have an acknowledgement and of the pain and the suffering that things did go wrong and that people weren't protected when they should have been. That acknowledgement is really important for victims and survivors to see evidence that others understand what has happened and are taking responsibility for it. And that responsibility is a real key part of the remedy process, I think. Building on that narrative and that acknowledgement, that's when an apology can be offered in a meaningful way, because victims and survivors know that that apology is real and it references those failings. And that's quite a long process already, but it's the foundation for everything that comes after. And throughout that process and everything that comes after, a key thing is the opportunity for survivors to be a part of the solution. So that's listening to survivors, not just listening to them, even giving them influence. So that's been a kind of historically a key issue. These, an athletes group, it can exist, but it's parallel to a decision-making body. So affording influence to people is a really important part of restoring the power and balance that has kind of marked their experience in the sport. And that is also a key way for people to know that others won't suffer it in the same way in the future. That is a very important part of remedy for survivors. I think the last thing is really that there's a lot of risk that this kind of involvement of survivors in the remedy and the prevention can be quite re-traumatizing. And so I think one kind of important thing to keep in mind is on that narrative, that foundation of what has gone wrong, we need to be really careful that we don't bring in elements of that into the remedy process. And so what I'm talking about here is some of my research in gymnastics, where there's a gender dynamic. A lot of the coaches and decision makers tend to be men, and most of the athletes across different gym sports are women. And so when we go into a remedy process, it's nice to have women either leading the way, preferably even survivors and athletes leading the way. This just flips the dynamic on its head, because the experience of athletes has been, their voices have been dismissed a lot of the time. And so centering those voices is part of the remedy. That's, one of the most important things we've learned over the last year or so.
Centering the voices of victims and survivors as part of the remedy. What a powerful message there. And thank you, Georgia, for sharing so concisely some really great themes to get us starting off. A helpful outline, I think, to know what we're aiming for. So let me move to you now, Joyce. Georgia's talked a bit about the remedy process from the victim and survivor's perspective. You really have been doing groundbreaking work in trying to incorporate that and to move the processes forward for institutions. But for institutions, this is an important piece of, nonetheless, a complex jigsaw of rights and responsibilities that you have to balance. Can you share with us some of the challenges perhaps that you've encountered in trying to take survivor-centered approaches, and perhaps even more importantly, can you share some of your learnings and progress today?
Thank you very much, Kat, and to everybody else on the panel, and for the privilege of being part of this today. I want to really start by picking up what you said at the start, Kat, and Georgia reflected. The preventative measures are critical, but if we as sports are really serious about eradicating abuse in sport, we've also got to be part of the remedy. And that means we have to tackle difficult cases that come in and be prepared to do so. I think all sports, and certainly FIFA, would put their hands up, certainly we would, and say we were late to the table in this respect. You know, I don't think this was on the radar of sports for many years, and it's only more recently, with the cases that have been reported, the US gymnastics case, of course, in particular, but others that have come forward. And this might sound a bit strange, but frankly, you know, we welcome that these cases come forward. That's the only way that we're going to be able to provide remedy to athletes and players, and to ensure that the future is a better space for everybody and a safer space for everybody. We also have to acknowledge that children are a key part of our sports, and of course them and women and other vulnerable adults, disabled para-athletes, for example, are extraordinarily vulnerable. So what happens when a case comes in? You know, if we're really frank about this in sports, our codes, our regulations are set up for different crimes within sport and sports responsibility. It's moral and ethical responsibilities in that regard. And we have faced some challenging cases, some of course very high profile in the media. And we have learned a lot of lessons, and we still learn lessons. I think all of us can put our hands on our hearts and say we all continue to learn lessons. But what we've really understood is the importance of the survivor-centered approach. How have we got about that so far? Well, not least ensuring that our senior leadership, including our president himself, understands the challenges, backs the work that we're trying to achieve. Our colleagues that we work with in the ethics processes, so that's where we would investigate and sanction a football official for abuse, are working very concretely with us. We launched a care package more recently, I think last year, but don't quote me on that, in our understanding that we also need to be mindful of the trauma in providing evidence to such cases. We're also really mindful that most of these are criminal offences and have requirements in that regard. And lastly, we're mindful that not every state statutory authority is yet set up to be able to support those processes. But where possible, of course, FIFA always cooperates with the agreement of the person concerned, unless it's a child, of course, in involving the criminal and child protection agencies. So what are the challenges? Obviously, these are played out in the media quite often. That can bring an incredible pressure to those involved in these cases. And we have to be and remain very steadfast and mindful about that we do the right things in the right order. We don't have the same powers as criminal authorities do. And, you know, I've had people say to me, why didn't you go in and seize this, do that, whichever? And of course, there are limited powers, while of course there are lower thresholds in the requirements to find a perpetrator guilty and to sanction them within the sports framework. However, as sports, we cannot suspend somebody for an unlimited period without the evidence to do so. And you know this process well, Kat, in the work you've done together with FIFA, in that we have independent chambers. So there is an independent judge that sits on our independent committee that has a chamber of independent experts that review the evidence that's submitted to them, will agree based on that evidence onto a temporary suspension while an investigation takes place, and then ultimately decides whether there has been a breach and what that sanction should be. We have banned several people for life from football and levied substantial fines. I would like to note that we haven't received those fines, but nevertheless, those sanctions have happened. So we're mindful that this is traumatizing for players, athletes that have the courage to come forward. So we have adopted a means, and it is a work in progress, of providing therapy support from the very beginning, and also working together to try to prevent that athlete or player has to revisit their evidence and of course the re-traumatization that can happen each time that you repeat that narrative. We also sit within the framework that anybody has a right to appeal within the Court of Arbitration of Sport, and that may mean that evidence has to be repeated at another date. And these are all works in process that we as FIFA are undertaking. So I think it's about understanding that when things seem slow, it's not necessarily because FIFA isn't taking action. When people receive, a bland statement that says there's an investigation ongoing, we can't comment, it's because we have to make sure the case isn't prejudiced, and that indeed, if somebody is guilty, that we are able to proceed and do our jobs correctly and sanction them. And in addition, of course, like in any proceedings, the accused has rights as well in how they are investigated and treated. I think the other thing I would like to say, and what we've learned, and I know we're going to speak a little bit about the new entity that we're working hard to achieve, is that we've also learned the importance of a team being on the ground, of specialists, of trained psychologists that are used to working in such cases, maybe not in sport, but with experience in working with those that have been abused and in supporting them in being able to give the evidence that we require to sanction somebody. And in addition to that, the importance of local therapy support, that we're not parachuting in from Switzerland, from Zurich, from Geneva, from Lausanne, wherever, and descending on individuals and saying, well, okay, we're here now, give us your evidence. And those have been some of our key learnings, really, in what we've done so far. And I just want to re-underline, we continue to learn each day. We understand more and more the importance of the athlete, the player being at the center of this, and what really a victim-centered approach actually really means, or a survivor-centered approach means. So, I always say this, we're not perfect at FIFA, but we are trying really, really hard to do the right things and to get better at the work we do.
Thank you, Joyce, and we're really grateful for all of the efforts that you put in. I think some important principles there, useful to understand the gamut of challenges that you face. Some of these are outside of even powerful federations' control, and there's a complexity to these cases, which I think we're all starting to understand in greater detail, the need for multidisciplinary interventions. But it's heartening to hear, and I know that this is your position, that there is room for everybody to learn. We have to work together in that space and tackle the difficult questions. One of the themes that Joyce flagged there, Yetsa, was around trauma and understanding trauma. And you specialize in the neurobiology of trauma, of attachment and empathy. And I use this phrase trauma informed a lot. I hear a lot of other people using it. It's really important as a concept, but I feel sometimes it's become a bit of a buzzword rather than a clearly understood set of benchmarks. So with your help, I'd like to lean into the science of trauma a little bit to understand how we can manage and recover from it. Can you give us some insights on that?
Oh yeah, happy to. Thanks so much, Kat. So you're right that the term trauma-informed tends to be a little bit overused, but poorly understood. So I would say in the simplest terms, trauma-informed organizations or institutions, they just do a couple of things really, really well. So one, they acknowledge that trauma is widespread, almost to the point of being ubiquitous. Number two, they know that the consequences of trauma are profound, diverse, and long-lasting. And then finally, they understand that there are paths to healing. So they recognize that it's a big deal, but then they also equally recognize that we can do something about it. And they, like sport, tend to be multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, any other word, disciplinary. And it sounds like from what Joyce described, FIFA's moving intentionally in that direction. So I think that's really heartening, first, just to say on the panel. So that said, I do advocate a biopsychosocial approach because I think for a few decades now, we've treated this topic like it's emotional or sometimes even political, when in fact it's a scientific one. Anecdotal data and stories are really important pieces, but I feel that the relevant and complementary biological data are objective, enduring, and much more measurable across time and space. They can help penetrate people's discomfort with some of those emotional overtones, I find, and then also they can generate awareness about the gravity of the topic. Finally, I think they open opportunities for remedy, which is the focus of this panel. So you said to lean in, so I'm happy to lean into the science with everybody here. So we're first going to consider the neurobiology of trauma, which includes exploitation and bias as well as sort of a spectrum. outside sport, there's a clear connection generally between adversity and toxic stress during childhood and then natural diseases in adulthood, like rheumatism, cancer, depression, anxiety, and other chronic conditions. If you read up on it a little bit, you might start seeing the term weathering, like weathering the storm of chronic stress. But suffice it to say, generally, trauma cuts years off your life and it lowers the quality of those remaining years, generally. Now, more specifically, these exposures, especially in a childhood, can cause a cascade of events in the brain, roughly broken down into 3 phases. So it's a little didactic, but I just want to go through the phases. So the first phase is that the stress response is reprogrammed in the brain. Phase 2 now comes with their physical changes to the developing brain, including attenuated development of the hippocampus, which is involved in memory, the amygdala, which is involved in emotion and motivation, which is important for sport. And then there are also emotional abnormal electrical activities and reduced function in the frontotemporal cortex and the cerebellar vermis. Don't worry about all the terms, but it's important for movement and posture, okay? The ability to regulate an upright posture. So just remember that one because we'll come back to it a little bit later. Phase 3 is kind of like the functional culmination of those first 2 phases, where a victim of trauma ultimately develops an altered threat perception, meaning that they perceive threat in non-threatening people and experiences. But on the flip side, and sometimes even more concerningly, they do not perceive threat in truly threatening people and experiences. So you can imagine how that could lead to intrusive thoughts, behaviors, and actions over the course of your entire life. Sometimes it even manifests in symptoms of like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, where a victim of trauma might find themselves crying one minute, laughing the next minute, stoic and detached one minute, highly volatile and enraged the next minute, things like that. So the structure of the brain changes. Now, it's not just the structure that changes, that's important. It's important how quickly it happens. So in newer animal models that I just talked about with one of my colleagues last week, I'm really excited about this. This is at the level of like PhD thesis right now, but we found that the amygdala structure changes within 5 minutes of exposure to a stressful experience. If you can imagine. So the amygdala, as I mentioned, is responsible for integrating emotion, emotional behavior and motivation, which is important for sport. So these data are showing us that when it comes to these critical structures in the brain, we literally don't have time to wonder whether or not it affects us, how seriously it affects us. It does, and it happens really fast. If you think about how long it takes for most cells and tissues in our body to adapt to external stimulus, we realize how fast it is. Like, Kat, if you start a new exercise program today, on a cellular level, the soonest you're going to see lasting benefits of that training is in 10 days, sometimes like 21 days is on average. But the amygdala changes structurally in 5 minutes. So the muscle cells and all other cells in the body really adapt pretty slowly to external stimuli, but not neurons. Our nerve cells work much more rapidly and they respond to the world around them with much more measurable structural change almost immediately. So these insights around the way neurons uniquely are sensitive to trauma really represent a whole paradigm shift in neurotransmission. I think it has huge implications for sport because in high performance generally, the mind and the body connection we know are critical. So I just want to mention a little example, and I know I'm going to go over time, sorry about that, but if we consider what happened to Simone Biles at the 2020 Tokyo Games, right? She couldn't spatially locate. So I mentioned before that the cerebellar vermis is a part of the brain that is affected by trauma. It's associated with the ability to maintain upright posture. Okay, so we'd have to do an objective study to prove it, but it seemed, knowing that what she experienced was connected to overwhelming traumatic stress, which was weathered by her and others over 2+ years of processing and reprocessing, being traumatized and re-traumatized, long-standing abuse. And the inability to spatially locate, which is kind of like having a dysfunctional gyroscope internally, is an organic neurobiological process, which in this case affected sports performance. So you can see the direct connection between neurobiology, brain structure, function, and sports performance. It's a direct line of connection. So that's the biology of trauma. On the pleasant and positive side, there's also the neurobiology of attachment and positive emotions, which can be induced by play and sport, which are carried out in responsible environments. Barbara Fredrickson is a scientist you should all look into if you have the time. She, in 2004, put forth this theory of broadening and building, where positive emotions like joy, inquisitiveness, love, contentment, they broaden our individual capacity for momentary thought action, meaning they promote the discovery of novel and creative actions, ideas, and social bonds. So the way we think, act, and work together expands when we're in the middle of games and sports and play, in responsible sports environments, because in those moments, in the midst of those positive attachments, we feel positively. So my lab and others are digging into the structural changes. Some of the questions that come up are, do these experiences reverse the brain changes of toxic exposures, for example? So hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll get into that, but we're asking those questions now. So in conclusion, and I know I'm about 6 minutes and 30 seconds, Kat, I apologize. But putting the bio right back into biopsychosocial is what we need to do, I feel, because it opens up new opportunities for access points and for remedy. Remedy and intervention are sort of, to me, synonymous, but it's important to also just step back and say, this is wisdom that athletes have intuitively known for as long as sports have been played. We perform better when we're in relational wellness, and we perform worse when we're in states of tension and toxicity. We know that. Georgia, you definitely know that. I know it for sure. So for me, it's just nice to be able to provide some empirical support to that collective intuition. Thanks.
It's so fascinating, Yetsa, and I don't mind at all that you went over, because I needed the step-by-step didactic explanation, because I'm not a scientist, but I find it so fascinating. And I completely agree with you when you talked about how sometimes we talk about trauma in a political, emotional way. I'm guilty of that. And I think this analysis that you provide with this clinical empirical evidence, both of the implications of abuse, but also the opportunities for healing and recovery. And when you and I spoke before, we were talking about people living their best life, right? That's where we want to get to through that remedy process. And I think knowing and understanding a bit more about the science behind it is fascinating. I also really enjoyed the connection to performance, because I think that part of remedy that I hear people speak about a lot of the time is the opportunity to play again, the opportunity to compete again. So really, really helpful and so inspiring to see you excited about it. And we look forward to hearing more and learning more about your research. I'll take it back to you, Georgia. Having heard that scientific explanation on how the remedy process or how trauma works, I think you have your own experiences, and you've worked hard with survivors to understand how engaging in that remedy process can help or hinder victims and survivors. So working with national sports bodies in the aftermath of the gymnastics abuse scandal in New Zealand has had its ups and downs, but you've been a really staunch advocate throughout about the co-creation of solutions, that working together, that sports bodies and survivors working together is both really important in terms of making sports safer, but also an important step in the healing remedy journey for survivors. So can you give us some practical tips and some advice on what you think helps victims and survivors engage, and what helps avoid re-traumatization when we try and be inclusive in the remedy process?
Yeah, cool. And I think Yetsa's talk just then is such a great foundation, because I think the key thing to remember is that this engagement carries such a heavy burden, an emotional burden for the victims and survivors. And so that is really the kind of key consideration behind all of this. The other thing is that really this kind of co-creation process that I'm going to be talking about, it's really about healing a relationship between those who have been harmed and the institutions who they expected to protect them from that harm. So we need to remember, it's a relationship building exercise that ideally results in preventing future harm. The first thing to avoid re-traumatization in this process is that is one of trust. The relationship isn't starting with a clean slate. So organizations need to work hard and with humility to rebuild that trust. And I think that comes back to what I was saying before about, flipping previous power dynamics and starting to really listen to survivors in this space. And building on that trust, a good way to kind of demonstrate that is believing what survivors are saying. And I don't just mean about their claims about what happened, but things like who the survivors say they're speaking for, then be it themselves or a wider group, and also believing what they say is needed to move forward. I can understand why institutions, and you might want to kind of question that and dig a bit deeper, but the fundamental thing is that it comes across as believing those people, not questioning or denying what they're saying. So ideally, the organizations and survivors will commit to partnering and co-designing solutions. And I want to say that, we're talking about engagement here, but there's lots of different levels of engagement. Informing survivors of what's happening is not sufficient. They're not sufficiently involved in the process. Consulting, slightly more involvement, but it's still, the same people in charge, pretty similar things happening. Partnering and co-designing are much higher levels of engagement. There's much more influence that survivors can have in that process. And I think, that's what we're aiming for, that level of high engagement. And co-designing a response to abuse can be both backward-looking, like what happened, why, and what do people need to heal from it, but also forward-looking, how can we prevent this from happening again? But when we're talking about these high levels of engagement in this space that has been previously traumatic for survivors, it's really important to have kind of core principles in place to ensure that the engagement is safe for survivors. And I want to just quickly run through these. So obviously, these should all be built, this engagement should be built on human rights principles. That's fundamentally going to give you a framework that is towards safety. But then digging a bit deeper into that, we need like an agreed scope and purpose of the engagement and how it's going to happen. We can begin by recognizing that survivors and organizations aren't engaging on equal footing and they need different things for this engagement to work. So survivors might need support people. And that's not for organizations to dictate how many support people or who or when. It comes back to believing what the survivors say they need for this to work. Probably to begin with, a facilitator who's experienced in working with survivors in a trauma-informed manner is also essential. A key thing is really that survivors have often had to re-explain their trauma a number of times to a number of people, often to people who don't understand it or don't recognize the hugely imbalanced power dynamic that has marked their whole experience in sport. And so having a trauma-informed facilitator in the room can help navigate some of those early relationship issues as you start working together. And I just want to give you an example about that. So a lot of the harm in sports, particularly in gymnastics, is built on athletes' voices and thoughts and feelings being denied or dismissed when they're practicing their sport. And this is really easy to kind of unwittingly perpetuate when you're in a co-design process. So just being aware of that and setting up the engagement to trust and believe in those voices is really key to making this work. A couple more things. So expertise and money. Staff from organizations are often paid for their time and their expertise in developing these kinds of processes. But survivors are also experts in their sport, and they also have a really good understanding of what happened and why. But it's not their full-time work. So it's really important to kind of recognize that through either giving survivors payment for this work or status as well, maybe like a consultant for the organization. That kind of thing can help rebalance some of the power dynamics we're talking about. In terms of time, sometimes meetings are going to have to take place in weekends or, outside 9 to 5, because the survivors have other things that they need to do in their lives. And also, I'm just going to throw to what Joyce was saying before, funding for psychology or other self-care kind of services to the people who are affected by doing this work is absolutely essential for maintaining safety in this space. Survivors are carrying the emotional burden of this work, and that can also mean that they're going to take a bit longer to do things. They need to stop and kind of protect themselves, and organizations need to be cognizant of that. And finally, the media. So I can see that organizations, are a bit wary of how things like this can play out in the media, and, understandably so. But I think a key thing for survivors is this door can't be closed for them. Often the media have been the only path to accountability for what's happened to them. And so they need to retain that option as a nice safety net if things don't go well. So, if there are concerns about talking to the media, then the best way to avoid that in a process like this is make sure the survivors don't feel like they have to talk to the media. Like, they can talk to you, and it's trusted and safe, and you're going to listen. So, I think these principles are all developed to make engagement safe and sustainable and empowering for survivors. It allows the trust to be rebuilt between them and the people they're working with. And what I'm really talking about here is a reconciliation process. And that's a really important part of the remedy that survivors are seeking. It's also mutually beneficial because both survivors and sports organizations are actually working towards a common goal. It's preventing future harm in sport.
Wow, thank you, Georgia. I'm sure there was lots of people scribbling away and making a list of these really helpful kind of practical pieces of guidance that you gave. And I think also hearing you speak about trust first and foremost, thinking a bit about Yetsa's neurobiology around attachment and forming kind of healthy relationships at its best, right? There are real opportunities to collaborate. If we get this right, is about healing that relationship. So thank you for those really, really helpful insights. I'm going to, on that note of kind of being a lineup, I'm going to take it back to Joyce, if I may, Joyce, and ask you to speak a little bit about this survivor-centered approach, which you've championed since you've joined. And I know you can't talk about any individual cases, so we'll be really cautious about that. But I think it would be helpful for people to understand, also in the context of Georgia's contributions, some of the components of what that survivor-centered approach looks like. Why are they so important for other people to adopt? And yeah, share some of your experiences there and thoughts about how we may go forward as an industry for the future.
Thank you very much, Kat. And I just wanted to make a nod to Yetsa and a fascinating overview. I've learned a great deal, and I'd love to talk to you a bit more about it and the important work you're doing. And Georgia as well, to the notes that you made that are incredibly important, of course. And us as sports in more and more beginning to understand that survivors are at the centre of all of this. I think there's a couple of things I would like to just flag as well. Investigative journalism is playing a critical role at the moment, not only in sports, but in other sectors where persons are feeling they can come forward or at least speak to investigative journalists about abuse. It might be non-recent or current and recent abuse. And in those power struggles and dynamics that exist in sports and other sectors. In that respect, we've understood a number of things, that it's going to take time for those that are abused to trust the sports where that has happened. And we need to acknowledge and accept that and to think about how we can best address that. And we've thought long and hard internally at FIFA about what steps could be taken to ensure that people can come forward, that they can do so and feel that it's trusted and confidential. that, as you say, right from the beginning, their reports of abuse are taken very seriously and understood, and that professionals are that first point of contact, that those are therapists, counsellors, those that really understand and can build a level of trust before a case maybe is taken forward. And we believe very firmly that the best way to do that is to set up an independent entity that is mandated, much like, you know, in the doping situation with WADA and others, is mandated by all international sports federations and the IOC indeed as well, FIFA not least, to be a portal of trust where people can report, can speak with experts, can consider whether they wish to take the case forward, what that looks like. And some may still choose to report to the sports governing body. It's entirely, obviously, at the person's own discretion. But we're deeply concerned, you know, as well as providing care support, we've actually had to help and support safe refuge for some of those that have been brave and come forward in our cases, sometimes in challenging places where their very lives have been threatened. And as sports bodies and as FIFA, we acknowledge that we are not expert in all of those components, that we need to work together in a multi-state, multi-government, multidisciplinary approach, that there's an incredible importance, as I said earlier, to ensure that criminal proceedings are followed through, obviously provided that's something that the survivor, the victim, wants to do, unless, of course, it's a child. As you know, in most parts of the world, there is a legislative requirement. And that we as sports get better at collaboration with those statutory agencies or authorities. That we also pool our resources, because we can work much better together as collective sports to bring an end to abuse in sports and to do our utmost to prevent harm happening in the first place. I think everybody in this panel knows very well, and I think many in the session today, that we've undertaken an extensive consultation process. It's been over a period of 9 months. We also shared the draft report for final comments and feedback and corrections. We are close to launching that final report, and I will put my hands up here and say, please forgive me, because as Kat mentioned, I've been particularly involved in the Afghanistan matter and had to really focus on that intensely in the last 6 weeks. But we will soon launch that report. We are really pleased by the number of sports that have shared with us their concerns, their commitment to establish such an entity. We're extremely pleased by civil society and by survivors and athletes and players' unions, athletes' unions that agree. We understand very well that the next phase is going to be critically important, that the voices of survivors are centre stage, that the eventual entity that it's set up works on all of the elements that I've mentioned, and always keeps the survivor, the victim in sport, at the centre of everything that's done. We believe that the investigation should be undertaken by the entity, and on conclusion, the report passed back to the competent, responsible sport with a recommendation of sanctions. We've also spoken at great length to a number of agencies, including Interpol, UNODC and others, about how we might consider a screening process at an international level, how we might prevent perpetrators from jumping from one region to another, or indeed one sport to another, and how we might carry a red list, if you will, of perpetrators in sport. So all of those things are on the table in consideration. We understand very well the role that the entity could play in preventative measures, but we truly believe that much of preventative matters also sits within each sport. It's not somebody else's job, it's everybody's job. And we believe that the entity will need to start in a phased approach so that it meets the expectations of those that come forward and that we don't let people down. We understand that it's going to take substantial funding. FIFA has already pledged to make a significant contribution to establish the entity. and we rely on sports and others and funding bodies to help to support the entity in this regard. We also see the entity fulfilling a role of acting as an umbrella for the national centres that are being established in different parts of the world. We welcome that, and we also foresee the entity playing a role to help motivate and support other countries that choose to do the same. So that's a snapshot overview. I'm clearly extremely passionate about this. I'm really pleased to count on, our very senior leadership. The president has been behind this at FIFA from the get-go. And I truly believe if we are serious in sports about what we set out to achieve and we say we want to do, then we have to have our leaders backing this, as well as, of course, everybody that works in this area day to day. And that's been our quest. I sincerely hope and pray that we achieve this new entity and that it does what it sets out to do, and it has an independence about it that gives everybody the confidence to use its services. So I think that's sort of an overview of where we are, why we're so committed to this at FIFA, and it is based on the lessons we've learned. And lastly, I would like to say, in some of the sports we've spoken to, that know they have an issue. There is no sport that does not have an issue of abuse. And you can be sure that your athletes, your players are being abused right now and have been previously. But if we're going to help one another as sports, we have to come together, and we have to recognize that not every sport has the resources that FIFA has at its disposal. So if we can do this together, we can really, for once, achieve something really remarkable. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Well, I think it's a message that we can and have to get behind, right? The lessons that we've learned from all of these cases. It is complicated, and it makes sense to team up, to pool resources. It's so important that we have the relevant expertise and independence. And I'm sure everybody here will be looking forward to that report and really hoping that we can turn that into a reality in a place where victims and survivors can report with confidence, and then get the necessary support and the protection as they go through this process. Now, we started a little bit late, so we're running a tiny bit behind. I want to go to Yetsa just for some concluding comments, and I also would like to invite the audience to stay on for a little bit longer, if you can, and then we'll try and tackle some of the questions that are coming in. So Yetsa, if I can ask you just briefly to wrap up this part of the conversation on a concrete note. If I was to say to you, okay, a sporting institution receives a report of concerning behaviour, what's the first thing that you think they should do? And what's the most important thing that you think they should do?
Good question, Kat. So yeah, this is going to tie into what Georgia has said and what Joyce has said as well. So both of those, believe. That's the first and most important. It takes a huge amount of courage, but also a lot of cognitive and emotional effort to disclose. You've got to first self-identify as a victim. Then you've got to calculate the risks and benefits, whether that's conscious or unconscious. That's what you're doing. And then you have to say something. So that's part of the reason why in many national contexts like mine, only between 2 and 8% of reports of abuse are false. So that means that 98% of the time, a person who's disclosing any kind of abuse, it's true. So believe is the first and most important. They kind of go together, Kat. But I'll just want to contextualize that a little bit for you in the injury paradigm we use in sports medicine. So if you think about how we approach accidental injuries in sports, we have a clear path to how we should approach non-accidental, right? So number one, we always believe that the injury is real. If someone comes to you and with a fracture, a twist, or a tear, we don't say, no, that's not a fracture, a twist, or a tear. At least not in responsible sports environments, right? We believe them and we're concerned about it. That's the first. Second, we reduce the risk of re-injury. So we remove the factors that make re-injury probable, and we remove the athlete from situations that could provoke re-injury. We don't just put someone with a fracture, a twist, or a tear back in the environment where they got it. Number three, we create a clear strategy with clear action points for facilitating healing over time, short, medium, and long term. We come up with a prognosis, at least in medicine anyway, and we carefully walk with the athlete along their path to healing. So in this work, trauma, et cetera, I think healing is oftentimes missed, strangely. It's almost as if we're so focused on punishment paradigms and perpetrator sanctions that we can miss the forest for the trees. This is an injury, and injuries require healing. The time frame might be a little bit different, and there might be, twists and turns along the way, but it's still an injury. So I would say in the case of abuse of any kind, in terms of what's been proven to work, Joyce mentioned a few, so it's really heartening to hear that FIFA is already investing in this, but not every clinical environment will have access. But you could think about nurturing therapeutic relationships between patient and clinicians of all kinds, whether it's a psychologist or a sports medicine doctor. You could think about explicitly enrolling in trauma-informed psychology support. Again, it depends on whether the patient wants a group or individual, but you can work around their choices. There's some great group modalities of cognitive behavioral therapy that work really well. Social workers in most environments are typically attuned to what's available in your community. So if you have social workers in your community, you can always ask them what's available here in my neighborhood, in my city, in my country, et cetera. I think one last important aspect of this is choice. Georgia mentioned it. In this space, agency and personal choice are required. So athletes have to be co-pilots along this healing journey. Lack of choice can be particularly damaging and devastating in this space. So, just to wrap up, everyone's already said it all already, and I've said it again. The wisdom lies with athletes. They intuitively know, and they've known for as long as sports has been played, what is healthy and what is unhealthy. We perform really well when we're anchored in relationships that are trustworthy. That's the word that Georgia used. And we perform really badly when we're anchored in toxic and tense relationships. So as we're building our interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary teams, we should be patient, but by all means, let the athletes lead the way.
Thanks, Yetsa. Co-pilots, I love that. So our takeaways are trust, a belief in people when they report. Those stats, I think, are really pertinent, worth repeating. I think that often, I've seen those stats across different jurisdictions that it's in and around that 2%, right? These fake reports are just not a thing, and it's a mistake to do anything other than to take a pro-belief approach. I love this analogy around preventing injury, and whether that means removing someone from an unsafe situation or removing the person of concern from that situation. These are all really important takeaways. Now, we are running out of time, so I'm just going to wrap up a couple of things, and I'm going to put some questions to the speakers afterwards. So please stand by, because I have to do a little bit of housekeeping and also tell you about the really exciting stuff that's happening tomorrow, because we're only halfway through now the Sporting Chance Forum. Of course, the first thing I have to do is thank these amazing speakers. I know that I hyped them at the beginning, but I'm sure you can all agree with me that hype was completely merited. Such a useful, concrete, helpful set of examples, and some really encouraging comments for the future and where we're going to go here. Please, everybody in the audience who is not in touch with the Centre for Sport and Human Rights, I encourage you to stay in touch and make contact. You can connect with me on this platform, on social media, with my colleagues through all the different ways to progress. We are all about trying to work together to find practical solutions. And in that vein, I'm really delighted to announce a pilot project that we're starting at the Centre, which is working with victims and survivors, acknowledging their expertise, both as lived experience and their technical expertise. I'm delighted to say that they will be remunerated and acknowledged as research experts in that process. I absolutely support Georgia's comments in that regard. And what we're trying to do is to develop a shared understanding of what good looks like. We understand this is complicated. Nobody's born knowing any of this stuff. We have to collaborate and come together. But we're looking towards concrete, practical guidance, what should be done by institutions when they receive reports. Everything from how do you take a trauma-informed approach to interviewing affected persons, to when and how do you suspend people on an interim basis. What does it mean? What are you communicating to victims and survivors if you perhaps don't suspend someone immediately? And how can that influence and interfere with the investigatory process? And then, of course, engaging survivors in co-creating better systems, or as we might have to call it, co-pilots from now onwards after Yetsa's comments. So please drop a line anywhere in the chat, anywhere else if you want to stay involved, give us your details, reach out. We'd love to interview people who have expertise in this. We'd love to have peer reviews. It is a pilot project. It's going to be a work in progress, an iterative piece of research. We know this is tricky. We just feel that there is an opportunity to bring experience of victims and survivors into the conversation in a more formal way. Or if you just want to be kept informed, let me know about that as well. Before I go to some of the really interesting questions that are coming out, reminding you that the Sporting Chance Forum is back tomorrow. 3 amazing sessions kicking off at midday Central European time, and we'll look at how to build sustainable mega sporting events. Then at 2 p.m, we're looking at the rights of child athletes, really important, and will dovetail into some of the conversation today. And then the final session tomorrow is forging a responsible sport leadership culture. Joyce mentioned it a little bit about the involvement of the senior leadership team at FIFA and how that's been such an important part of being able to build and look to solutions for the future. Amazing lineups for all 3 of those. So I hope you will be able to tune in for that as well. And now I'm going to have a little look at some of the questions, and perhaps I'll go back to you, Yetsa, in terms of a question that's come through, really interesting, around trauma-informed work. Does it necessarily mean that we have to label survivors as having PTSD? And the question is, I would like to think that awful things that happen to normal people, athletes, and this doesn't lead to their diagnoses. That's right, isn't there? There's a nuance there. We need to be a bit careful about throwing around the word trauma and how we tackle that.
Yeah, 100%. That's a great question. And no, so certainly not. The person who asked the question is correct. The long list of athlete impacts, potentially, of trauma, not everyone responds the same way. And trauma includes everything from implicit bias, discrimination, and harassment, all the way to overt sexual assault or physical assault, include, I'll just mention 14, but it's a longer list. First, physical injury. Second, physical illness, performance loss, sport dropout, economic loss, doping and other forms of cheating, disordered eating, eating disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, that's in there right in the middle, self-harm, social isolation, low self-esteem, volatile mood states, depression, anxiety, and other mood disorders, and then challenging interpersonal relationships that endure throughout the lifetime. So it's a long list of potential impacts. We don't necessarily have to coalesce it all on that diagnosis PTSD. And some of these impacts are not necessarily diagnosable. They don't exist in any medical textbook anywhere. However, just to make the point that it can be as extreme as PTSD, it's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and you mentioned early on the kind of acknowledgement of enduring and not permanent, but enduring challenges that people face. And I think that's a really important takeaway. So thank you for that question. It was a really helpful one to clarify and bring some nuance into it. Joyce, I'll come to you. There's a couple of questions, an easy one early doors, which is the title of the report and when will it be published? And perhaps we can just commit to share that if it is a public document. And I know that you will through FIFA social media channels as well. And I'll tack on a second question in terms of reporting abuses. You've tackled this a little bit already. We know this is a real challenge, creating an environment of trust and safety that allows people to come forward when the relationship has already been damaged. Georgia, I think, highlighted that in a really important way, that victims and survivors will feel let down by the institutions. And the question here is that the lessons from previous cases are that abusers stay in power for so long because teenage athletes can't torpedo their careers or personal safety to report. What can be done to tie funding, things like FIFA Forward funding or IOC funding, to background checks, anonymous and meaningful reporting, diversity, equity, inclusion, more women in federation leadership, etc.? Can we tie funding to some of those important structural changes?
So there's a couple of questions in there. I honestly can't remember the title of the report because we've worked with Ingrid Buechner, as you know, to undertake the consultation. And my bad, I should have thought about that before, but it reflects that it's the findings of a long, extensive consultation, and it lays those out very clearly, hopefully. The plan is to launch it soon. I don't want to tie to a date because I haven't spoken with Ingrid and Mario about that, but I know the plan is to launch it soon. It will be shared initially with all those that took part, and there's more than 230 stakeholders worldwide and groups that have taken part, so it has been extensive. And I don't see any reason why it's not a public-facing document for FIFA. That makes perfect sense. In regards to funding and the questions related to that, absolutely right and proper. What I can tell you about the Forward Development Funding Programme and obligations, those were introduced into the recent cycle as obligations for every member association. So this is where FIFA invests back into global football development through its member associations, regional associations and confederations. And there are obligations in there to embed safeguarding measures and to be mindful of infrastructure, etc., in investing particularly in youth programs, projects, events, construction, training centres, etc. However, what we realised and understand is that we have to build capacity to support that. It's not enough to not, to have some tick check boxes. So one of the things I think some of you will be aware of is the Safeguarding Sports Diploma we launched earlier this year. That's a program that has been developed together with a range of experts with the Open University, and it aims to professionalise the role of a safeguarding officer, primarily in football, but we were asked by a number of entities to make it available as an open learning experience for all sports. There are 2,000 persons undertaking that already, and we at the moment are on target to have 200 FIFA learners that have dedicated tutorials, assessments, learning experiences, workshops, webinars, on-site workshops as well, to be qualified by the end of next year. Why is that important? Well, one, we discovered, and I'm really still shocked by this, that that's not only the first course of its type in sport, that's the first of its type in any sector. So there's been an underinvestment across the piece, sports, wider sectors, in these important roles. So if we're serious about prevention, the other that we've undertaken is to ensure that we have now provided guidance and training to all FIFA staff, so all of the FIFA staff, and including in our 10 regional development offices, to understand, to recognize when someone chooses to disclose, when they see something that doesn't feel right, and not to investigate, not to rush and be judge and jury, but how they mindfully recognize, record and report, and then leave a proper confidential process to ensue. So those are some of the steps we've taken and are taking, but I come back to the need for this entity, and I completely agree with the question. We have to bed this into funding, into everything that we do. And I just want to lastly say the real importance of leadership. So our member associations, we are engaging with the presidents, the secretary generals, the senior leadership, as well as asking them to put forward and nominate appointed safeguarding officers that will have credible bedded roles that we are training currently, so that at the end of next year, we begin to have competent persons across the globe that are able to take this forward. I think that's everything.
Thank you, Joyce.
I hope so.
It was a big question and a really helpful answer, and you teed up my reminder for everybody brilliantly. I think leadership is so important. If you want to know more about that, we're looking at forging a responsible sport leadership culture tomorrow at 4 p.m. Central European time. The first session tomorrow kicks off at midday, looking at sustainable mega sporting events. Thank you so much to our audience for those brilliant questions. I hope you enjoyed today's session. I hope it gave you some practical takeaways. A huge thanks to the speakers again. What a wonderful set of insights in terms of moving forward and trying to make the remedy process better for everybody involved and more effective and more human rights compliant, which is what we're all looking for. So big thank you to you all. I'll wrap it up. Please stay in touch and make sure you follow us on socials. Have a great evening and great day for all of you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Take care. See you soon.